Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. My research focused on mapping out the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, or at least part of it. And last week, I talked about a clinical trial that was just conducted to explore whether psilocybin, sort of like the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, which is a psychedelic hallucinogen, whether or not psilocybin might be a viable treatment for depression. Well, a study was just published, just a bit before the results of that clinical trial were published, that helps to describe what exactly hallucinations are, or to be more specific, why we're even capable of having hallucinations. And I thought it might be worth exploring, the findings of that study, because they propose a pretty broad model that I think is pretty interesting. And so part of why I was drawn to this study is because it comports with the explanations of severe psychosis that I've seen in the past, and there's no doubt that the participants in that clinical trial, for the treatment of depression, were experiencing hallucinations, for sure. So why not explore a possible explanation of why they were experiencing those hallucinations, and therefore why we're even capable of experiencing hallucinations in the first place? Well, so this was a study that was published in ELife by Kenneth Wengler, Andrew Goldberg, George Chahine, and Guillermo Horga, or probably Guillermo Horga. Who are at the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University, the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and the Department of Psychiatry at Yale. And, by the way, just a few people ask why I mention the names of people involved in these studies, and this is why. When you get into science, part of the job is to follow the work of specific people, and the people with whom they work, to follow, what they publish. So it's sort of like following the books that a specific author writes, or following the differences between the types of laptops or phones that various companies make, right? You can get a sense of the track record of a group of scientists from their history of work, just like you can get a sense of the quality of products that a given company puts out over the years. So anyways, this group hones in on a model called hierarchical perceptual inference, which is, just a phrase that describes the emergence of incorrect concepts or even perceptions as a result of errors that arise from how the brain represents reality. So I know that, even my interpretation of what hierarchical perceptual inference means is probably inscrutable, but this is actually a pretty intuitive dynamic. So first, imagine a hierarchy, your favorite hierarchy, like a hierarchy of needs, a hierarchy of government, or even a hierarchy of an inferno. What you'll notice is that these are organizations or organizational models with some items ranked above the others as a function of their authority, their function, or their relative control. And so those aren't super intuitive examples, but the point is that this group is corroborating a model of hallucinations and delusions that involves higher levels and lower levels. We can get rid of these. So higher levels and lower levels are the systems that enable us to both get a sense of what's literally happening around us, moment to moment, as well as the broader context in which those things are happening. So here's an example. You can see that there are some flowers behind me. You see them, and even if you don't know what specific type of orchid they are, Phalaenopsis, but pretty much the most common, you'd probably be pretty surprised if I just started eating those flowers one by one, right? So the lower level of that capability that you have, that you don't even notice, by the way, right, is that you recognize that you're seeing a flower. But then the higher level is that you know that this flower is not only never eaten, but it would be extremely strange if I just began eating them all of a sudden, in this moment, while I'm talking about, how it is that we have hallucinations and delusions. So the lower levels that these are flowers, right? Your sensory systems are accurately decoding the photons splashing up against your eyes, telling you that it's a flower. The higher level is that you'd be weirded out if I was munching on them while continuing to talk. Your inference of my intentions, the social context, and so on, places those simple perceptions into a broader context. And that helps you understand what's happening right now, what's likely to happen to those flowers, and whether you'd feel that a given event would be absolutely strange and surprising if it involved those flowers. Lower level, higher level. Okay, so here's the basic argument that the scientists who wrote this study make. Hallucinations and delusions emerge from disruptions of the relationships between these hierarchical, items or processing. So, these relationships between lower processes and higher processes. So, in other words, like disruptions between the simple lower sensory inputs, you're seeing that these are flowers, and the more complex higher cognitive processing. You understand that this isn't a perfectly cooked lobster, right? And so it'd just be weird if I just started eating them. They note that the higher levels of this hierarchy involve more abstract belief states, and those processes take up a bit more time to bubble up into our conscious awareness, right? So this is, probably somewhat intuitive as well, believe it or not. So here's an example. Have you ever been in the situation where somebody says something, but they're mumbling, or you're in a noisy environment, and you just don't quite hear what they're saying right away, but after a second or two, after you've already said what, you actually do understand what they said, and you don't even quite know why. Like, why all of a sudden you do understand what it was they were saying when initially you didn't. So that's what we're talking about. That the early sensory experience of literally hearing sounds, didn't trigger understanding right away, but after a bit more contextual processing, like the movement of their lips, the other words that you did hear them say, and like the broader conversation that you've been having, you arrive at exactly what they said. And then, right after you said what, you already understand, what they're saying, right as they begin repeating the word that they said. It's sort of irritating when that happens, right? But it's also kind of remarkable that we're even capable of that kind of contextual processing, that we don't even have to hear the word a person says, but seconds later we can decode it. And it's just, this is all completely subconscious. So this group worked with 331 healthy control participants, and then 254 patients who were diagnosed with either schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. So in other words, they were comparing, the broad neural activity of people with and without schizophrenia. And this was a pretty expansive study. They did a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to get into everything that they did, but they highlight studies that suggest that higher levels of the neural hierarchy represent more and more abstract belief states, and those processes take longer periods of time than the simpler, purely sensory perceptions. And so this group found that there were differences in the timing of the responses that different parts of the brain exhibited when it came to both hallucinations and delusions. Specifically, those with schizophrenia who experience more severe delusions as opposed to like hallucinations, they seem to exhibit reactions in areas of the brain associated with more abstract, higher level interpretations. It took a bit longer for them, relative to controls. And those with more severe hallucinations tended to exhibit extended lower level regional processes, right? So in other words, like the neuronal processes underlying the ability of a person to decode that this is a flower, right, seem to take a bit longer in patients with schizophrenia who tended to experience hallucinations more frequently, while those who experienced delusions tended to have that same lengthened reaction within regions that enable you to realize that it would be strange if I started eating the flowers, right? So not only that, but their findings of this unique reaction of patients with schizophrenia who predominantly experience hallucinations seem to center on the auditory system rather than other sensory systems. And so, as opposed to like vision or touch. And that sort of makes sense, right? So, it makes sense given that hallucinations that are experienced by those with schizophrenia tend to be auditory, right? Predominantly auditory hallucinations. So, that's a pretty cool finding. The study wasn't perfect because 93% of the patients in the study were taking antipsychotics, right, to treat their schizophrenia. And so there are a bunch of problems with interpreting the results, but they do acknowledge that they've seen similar differences in brain responses, even when they control for the effects of medication. So, regardless, it's just worth keeping in mind that there is some neuropharmacology at play here that's not, doesn't necessarily characterize schizophrenia. But anyways, that said, this study is interesting for a few reasons. So first of all, it's an interesting possible explanation for why it is that some people diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to exhibit more hallucinations while others tend to exhibit more delusions, right? There's, different manifestations of schizophrenia. But the neuropharmacologist in me can't help but wonder if this might help to reveal a serotonergic role or serotonin-related role in the regulation of hallucinations, with the types of substances I discussed last week in mind. So psilocybin and psychedelic drugs. Given that these substances are well known for their effects on sensory perception, as well as cognition, of course, But, particularly sensory perception, their effects on sensory perception, vision, these types of things, it's sort of unique to this class of drugs. And so I have to wonder about the involvement of serotonergic signaling in regulating this balance, between sensory inputs or the lower level processing, again, seeing the flower, and then cognitive processes, knowing that higher level processing is that these are not for eating, right? But so ultimately, it's some cool evidence that perception is the byproduct of this balance between taking incoming information and understanding that incoming information. And any perturbation or neuronal quirk that might cause schizophrenia that alters this balance between higher and lower levels results in errors that compromise our ability to either get accurate information about our environments or errors in how we understand and react to that information about our environments. And so this whole hierarchical model reminds me of a project that came out, I guess, more than several years ago at this point, put out by Google, called Deep Dream, which, if you're unfamiliar with Deep Dream, it's totally worth checking out. But quickly, the short story is that the software that Deep Dream is it's designed to detect like faces and patterns in various images. Ultimately, the goal of this program is to enable Google to automatically classify types of images, like images of dogs or trees or people. But what they did with Deep Dream is that they tweaked this program a bit to produce something kind of strange and kind of wonderful. So, for Deep Dream, they basically ran that process, that recognition process, in reverse. After having trained their program, their system, to recognize various shapes, in objects, they ran in reverse, such that the program is basically like projecting related shapes onto images. So, rather than like fairly accurately detecting that like this is a picture of a jellyfish, or I guess multiple jellyfish, they would run iterations of these detection events, resulting in the program detecting the presence of things that kind of sort of resemble its own memory of other images that it had seen, and then projecting those images that it detects onto the original image, right? So after 10 rounds of these detection iterations, you can see it begins to detect all kinds of strange animals and buildings and spiders, even what looks like a person up towards the top maybe. And then they run it 50 times. And you can see, the jellyfish is completely absent at this point. And, you're just seeing like a bunch of like weird morphed animals, like particularly dogs to my eyes. And, it's just like completely strange chaos. And so the reason that this example came to my mind is that the system that they set up to make Deep Dream is actually rather similar to how the brain does the same thing. The human brain does the same thing. There are lower level inputs that then feed into higher level detection and recognition and so on. And so, it works rather well when the relationships between these different levels of detection and recognition and stuff, that system works pretty well. But when you manipulate those relationships, between the lower and the higher level systems, instead of recognizing a jellyfish, it makes projections onto the starting image and then ultimately sees things that aren't there. Just because that balance between those different levels of detection and recognition, lower and higher levels, have been sort of messed up. And so, by the way, in case you're interested, there are folks out there who've made their own versions of Deep Dream that you can check out. One that I checked out was it's called deepdreamgenerator.com. And so so we'll do boop boop boop. Here's an image or here's what it produced for an image that I use for my like avatars. It's pretty fun, pretty cool. So anyway, like similar errors are at the core of what these scientists are describing and what they ultimately identified in the brains of people with schizophrenia. And what's fascinating is that a ton of people who've experienced psychedelic hallucinogens, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, so people who've experienced those substances have remarked about how reminiscent the images that are produced by Deep Dream are of the experience that the drugs can have on sensory perception. It's not the same, of course, but it's sort of similar. And, it just strikes me as like a super fascinating convergence of both neuropharmacology, the drugs, and computer programming onto essentially the same fundamental system of how sensory information and cognition interact with one another to deliver our sense of reality, higher level and lower level relationships. So pretty cool, huh?